October 6, 1941. The approach to Msensk, south of Moscow. The Russian autumn, notorious for its melancholy beauty, had rapidly dissolved into the early savagery of winter. A biting wind swept across the rolling steppes, carrying with it the first stinging grains of sleet that would soon bury the German advance in a tomb of white. But for the gun crew of the 37th Anti-Tank Battalion attached to the 4th Panzer Division, the weather was a secondary concern. Their immediate reality was the viscous, clinging mud, the Rasputitsa that sucked at their jackboots and paralyzed the logistical veins of the Wehrmacht. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the acrid metallic tang of exhaust fumes belching from engines that were never designed to operate in such extremes. Obergefreiter Hans Müller wiped the grime from the optical sight of his 37mm Park 36 anti-tank gun. His hands were numb, the leather of his gloves worn thin after 4 months of relentless campaigning. Beside him, his loader shivered, hugging a shell casing to his chest as if it were a warm loaf of bread. They were the tip of the spear, the vaunted masters of blitzkrieg who had rolled across Poland and France with contemptuous ease. But here, in the vast, swallowing emptiness of the Soviet Union, the geometry of war was changing. Through the grey mist, a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of their boots, a sound distinct from the high-pitched whine of their own panzer engines. It was a guttural, deep-chested roar, the mechanical heartbeat of something massive approaching from the tree line. Out of the fog, it emerged, a silhouette that defied the boxy, vertical architecture of German tank design. It moved with a predatory grace that seemed impossible for a machine of its size, its wide tracks churning the mud that had immobilized the German trucks hours ago. This was the T-34. Müller barked the order to fire. The loader slammed the 37mm armor-piercing shell into the breech. The block slid home with a crisp, metallic clack. Müller aligned the crosshairs on the sloping frontal plate of the approaching Soviet beast, range 400 meters, a kill shot by any standard manual of the Heer. He squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked violently, digging its spades deeper into the slush. A tracer streak slashed the grey air, terminating squarely on the Russian tank's glacis plate. But there was no explosion, there was no shuddering halt. Instead, Müller watched in paralyzed horror as the shell simply vanished into the sky, deflected effortlessly by the 60-degree slope of the armor. A shower of sparks marked the point of impact, a mocking firework that signaled the end of German armored supremacy. The T-34 did not even slow down. Its turret, shaped like a crude hexagonal nut, began to rotate. The long barrel of its 76mm gun swung toward Müller's position like the finger of a vengeful god. At that moment, surrounded by the vast indifference of the Russian landscape, the German crew realized that their weapon, the standard anti-tank gun of the most advanced army in the world, was nothing more than a door-knocker, a useless toy against the steel monster grinding toward them. This scene, repeated up and down the Eastern Front in the autumn of 1941, marked the precise moment the Wehrmacht woke from its dream of invincibility and found itself staring into a technological abyss. To truly understand the magnitude of this shock, one must step back from the mud of Mtsensk and return to the pristine planning rooms of Berlin, years prior to this catastrophic encounter. The German military establishment, intoxicated by their lightning victories in the West, had cultivated a dangerous arrogance. This hubris was not merely a product of nationalistic fervor, but was deeply rooted in a belief in German engineering supremacy. The Mercedes-Benz, the Krupp steelworks, the optical precision of Zeiss, these were the pillars upon which the Third Reich rested. The prevailing wisdom in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht was that the Soviet Union, a nation of peasants recently emerging from feudalism, could not possibly produce sophisticated machinery. Intelligence reports describing Soviet armored capabilities were dismissed as exaggeration or Bolshevik propaganda. The German worldview simply did not allow for the existence of a Slavic machine that could outclass the products of the Ruhr Valley. In June of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million men against the Soviet frontier, the German panzers were the undisputed kings of the battlefield. The Panzer III, designed to fight other tanks, and the Panzer IV, designed for infantry support, were marvels of ergonomics and tactical utility. They possessed excellent radios, allowing for complex coordination. They had 5-man crews, separating the commander from the gunner, a layout that maximized combat efficiency. Their optics were superb, allowing them to hit targets at ranges where the enemy could only guess. Against the obsolete Soviet T-26 and BT-7 light tanks, which made up the bulk of the Red Army's armored forces, the panzers were wolves among sheep. The burning hulks of thousands of these older Soviet tanks lining the roads from Brest-Litovsk to Minsk only reinforced the German conviction that they faced a technologically inferior foe. However, this initial slaughter masked a critical intelligence failure of historic proportions. Hidden deep within the Soviet interior, beyond the reach of German reconnaissance flights, the Soviet industrial complex had been undergoing a radical transformation. Led by the brilliant and pragmatic designer Mikhail Koshkin, the Kharkiv locomotive factory had been engaged in a desperate race against time. Koshkin was a man who understood the Russian terrain, the bitter winters, the scorching summers, and the lack of paved roads. He knew that a tank designed for the manicured fields of Western Europe would die in the Russian steppe. He envisioned a machine that prioritized three factors in perfect balance: firepower, protection, and mobility. This trinity became the T-34. Koshkin's journey was not one of smooth sailing. He fought against the Soviet bureaucracy, which favored the multi-turreted land battleships like the T-35, monsters that were impressive in parades but useless in combat. He fought against the purges that had decimated the engineering ranks. In a final act of defiance and dedication, he personally drove the prototype T-34 from Kharkiv to Moscow in the dead of winter to present it to Stalin, a grueling trek that likely contributed to the pneumonia that claimed his life in 1940, just months before the German invasion. He never saw his creation in battle, but his ghost would haunt the German generals for the next 4 years. The existence of the T-34 was not entirely unknown to German intelligence, but its significance was woefully underestimated. Rumors of a new universal tank were filed away and ignored. When the invasion began, the few T-34 seconds available were often lost to mechanical breakdowns or poor crew training, their crews abandoning them without firing a shot. German recovery teams would drive past these abandoned hulks, noting them as curiosities but failing to inspect them with a critical eye. It was only when the front lines stabilized, and the Soviets began to deploy the tanks in concentrated numbers under competent commanders like Mikhail Katukov, that the nightmare truly began. The door knocker incident was not an anomaly, it was the new reality. The psychological impact of the T-34 on the German soldier cannot be overstated. For 2 years, they had been told they were the master race, wielding the ultimate weapons of war. Now, they watched their shells bounce off the enemy, while their own tanks were torn open from distances of 1 kilometer or more. The panic that set in the T-34 terror spread like a contagion from the front lines back to the headquarters. It forced a crisis of confidence that shook the Wehrmacht to its core. Reports began to flood into Berlin, initially met with disbelief. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Arm, wrote urgently to the High Command, demanding an immediate commission to investigate this new threat. He knew that if Germany did not adapt, the war was lost. This leads us to the pivotal moment of inspection, a scene of intense technical scrutiny that took place in November 1941. A special Panzer Commission arrived at the front, tasked with dissecting a captured T-34 divided by 76. Among them were leading engineers from Porsche, Henschel, and Daimler-Benz, men who had spent their lives refining the art of automotive engineering. They approached the captured Soviet machine with a mixture of professional curiosity and dread. The tank sat in a field workshop, the smell of diesel fuel and damp steel hanging heavy in the air. It looked crude compared to the machined perfection of a German panzer. The welding was rough, with visible seams. The casting of the turret was textured and uneven. There was no paint on the interior, only bare metal. To the refined German eye, it looked like a tractor. But as they began to measure and test, the sneers faded, replaced by a profound and terrifying respect. The first and most revolutionary feature was the armor. German tanks of the era, like the Panzer IV, were boxes. Their armor plates were vertical, set at 90 degrees to the ground. This maximized internal volume and made manufacturing easier, but it offered no ballistic advantage. The T-34, however, was a study in angles. The frontal glacis plate was 60 millimeters thick, but it was set at a 60-degree angle. The engineers pulled out their slide rules and performed the trigonometry. A projectile hitting that slope didn't just have to penetrate 60 millimeters of steel, it had to travel through the diagonal plane of the plate. The effective thickness was effectively doubled to over 90 millimeters. Furthermore, the slope dramatically increased the probability of ricochet. The kinetic energy of a striking shell was not absorbed, but deflected upward. The T-34 was not just armored, it was geometrically shielded. It was a concept known as sloped armor, and while known in theory, no one had applied it so ruthlessly and effectively to a production vehicle. The engineers moved to the suspension system. They crawled underneath the chassis, expecting to find the complex system of leaf springs and torsion bars typical of German design. Instead, they found the Christie suspension. Named after the American inventor J. Walter Christie, whose designs had been rejected by the US military but eagerly purchased by the Soviets, this system used large, rubber-rimmed road wheels on long coil springs. There were no return rollers for the tracks. The tracks simply draped over the large wheels. This design allowed for an immense range of vertical movement for each wheel, enabling the tank to travel at high speeds over rough terrain without shaking the crew to death. While German tanks had to slow down to a crawl over broken ground to avoid throwing a track or breaking an axle, the T-34 could glide over craters and trenches. Then there were the tracks themselves. The German engineers measured the width, 500 millimeters. The Panzer IV's tracks were only 360 millimeters wide. This discrepancy explained why the German offensive had stalled in the mud while the Soviets maneuvered freely. The wider tracks of the T-34 distributed the vehicle's 26-ton weight over a larger surface area, drastically reducing ground pressure. The T-34 exerted less pressure on the ground per square centimeter than a man's foot. It could literally float over the mud that swallowed the German army whole. This was not high technology, it was a practical adaptation to the environment, a lesson the German designers had ignored in their pursuit of over-engineered perfection. The inspection team then turned their attention to the heart of the beast, the engine. They opened the rear engine deck, expecting a gasoline engine similar to the Maybach power plants used in all German tanks. Instead, they found the V2. It was a massive, 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled diesel engine. The choice of diesel was a masterstroke. Diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, reducing the risk of the catastrophic fires that claimed so many panzer crews. But more importantly, the diesel engine was far more fuel efficient. The T-34 had a range of nearly 300 kilometers on internal fuel alone, while the Panzer IV struggled to reach 200. The V2 engine was also made with an aluminum block, a metallurgical luxury that shocked the resource-starved Germans. It was lightweight, powerful, and robust. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their entire logistical chain was built around gasoline. Finally, they examined the weapon, the 76.2mm F-34 gun. In 1941, the standard German tank gun was the short-barreled 50mm or the low-velocity 75mm, designed primarily for infantry support. The Soviet gun was a dual-purpose killer. It fired a high-explosive shell capable of decimating infantry and bunkers, but it also fired a high-velocity armor-piercing shell that could penetrate any German tank in existence at combat ranges. The gun was simple, rugged, and terrifyingly effective. The optical sights were indeed inferior to the German Zeiss optics. The glass was often bubbly, and the field of view narrow, but at the ranges where tank battles in the east were decided, usually under 800 meters, this disadvantage was negligible compared to the raw hitting power of the cannon. The report that went back to Berlin was devastating. It essentially stated that the German tank fleet was obsolete. The superiority was so total that some members of the Commission, in a moment of desperate pragmatism, suggested simply copying the T-34 bolt for bolt. They proposed that German factories should immediately retool to produce a direct clone of the Soviet tank. This idea, however, was met with fierce resistance. The pride of the German military-industrial complex could not stomach the idea of copying a Bolshevik design. Moreover, there were technical hurdles. The German aluminum supply was insufficient to produce the V2 diesel engine in mass quantities. The metric standards were different. The tooling would take a year to replace. Instead, the decision was made to design a counter-weapon, a tank that would incorporate the lessons of the T-34 but execute them with German engineering philosophy. This decision birthed the Panther tank. If one looks at the Panther, the influence of the T-34 is undeniable. The Panther abandoned the vertical armor of the Panzer IV for the steeply sloped glacis plate of the Soviet machine. It adopted wide tracks for better flotation. It aimed for a balance of firepower and mobility. However, the German propensity for over-engineering could not be suppressed. The Panther was heavier, more complex, and plagued by mechanical gremlins that never affected the rugged T-34. While the Soviets focused on producing thousands of good-enough tanks, the Germans obsessed over producing hundreds of perfect ones. The encounter with the T-34 also had a profound human cost that rippled through the war. We must consider the perspective of the German infantryman. For the first years of the war, the sight of a panzer was a symbol of salvation. It meant support, cover, and victory. After 1941, that confidence evaporated. Infantrymen watched their protectors burn. They learned that their own anti-tank weapons were useless. They were forced to resort to desperate measures, magnetic mines, Molotov cocktails, and bundling hand grenades together to stop the Soviet armor. A new kind of fear took root in the trenches, a tank phobia that sapped morale and paralyzed units. Conversely, for the Soviet crews, the T-34 was a symbol of national resilience. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and deafeningly loud. The transmission was so stiff that drivers often had to use a sledgehammer to shift gears. The lack of a turret basket meant the loader had to dance around the recoil guard of the gun while standing on ammunition crates. Casualties among T-34 crews were horrific, not because the tank was bad, but because they were thrown into battle in such vast numbers, often with minimal training. But the tank itself was forgiving. It could be repaired in a muddy field with basic tools. It could run on low-grade oil. It kept fighting when a German tank would have stalled. The rude awakening also forced a strategic shift in the air war. The Luftwaffe found that their light bombs were ineffective against the T-34. They had to develop specific tank-busting aircraft, like the Ju-87 Stuka, equipped with 37mm cannons, piloted by aces like Hans-Ulrich Rudel. The entire German war machine had to pivot to address this single technological threat. It consumed resources, time, and engineering talent that Germany simply did not have to spare. The legacy of this inspection, this moment of realization, echoed until the fall of Berlin. The rush to counter the T-34 led to the Tiger and the Panther. These were formidable machines, terrifying in their own right. The Tiger could destroy a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. But they were logistical nightmares. The Tiger consumed fuel at an astronomical rate. It required complex maintenance schedules that were impossible to maintain in the retreat from Stalingrad. For every Tiger that was destroyed in combat, many more were abandoned because they ran out of fuel or broke down and could not be recovered. The Germans fell into the trap of believing that quality could overcome quantity. They forgot the maxim that quantity has a quality all its own. By 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, the Germans fielded their new Panthers and Tigers. They expected these Wunderwaffen to sweep the field, but the Soviets countered with swarms of T-34 seconds. The Soviet commanders knew their tanks were individually inferior to the heavy German Cats. Their tactic was to close the distance, to get in close where the long guns of the Tigers were less effective and where the T-34's mobility allowed it to flank the slower German behemoths. It was a brutal, suicidal strategy, but it worked. The German offensive was blunted, not by superior technology, but by a design that allowed for mass production on a scale the Germans could not comprehend. While German factories were being bombed into rubble, struggling to machine precise gears for the Panther's complex transmission, the Soviet factories beyond the Urals were churning out T-34 seconds like sausages. They didn't paint them. They didn't polish the welds. They didn't install comfortable seats. They just built them, filled them with diesel and ammunition, and sent them west. In the time it took Germany to build one Panther, the Soviets built 10 T-34 seconds. The lesson the German engineers learned in that muddy field in 1941 was correct. The T-34 was superior, but they misunderstood why. It wasn't superior just because of the sloped armor or the diesel engine. It was superior because it was designed for total war, a war of attrition where elegance is a liability and simplicity is survival. As we reflect on the long shadow of the T-34, we must acknowledge it as perhaps the most influential weapon of the 20th century. It did not just win a war, it changed the philosophy of armored warfare forever. Every main battle tank in service today, the American Abrams, the German Leopard, the Russian T-90, traces its lineage back to the principles established by Mikhail Koshkin. The concept of the main battle tank, a vehicle that balances mobility, protection, and firepower, was born in the blueprints of the T-34. The arrogance of the German commanders in 1941 serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of underestimating an adversary. They looked at the rough casting of the Soviet steel and saw inferiority. They failed to see the genius in the brutality. They believed that culture and heritage dictated engineering capability. This racial and intellectual vanity cost them the war. The rude awakening was not just about a gun that couldn't penetrate armor, it was the shattering of a world view. Imagine, for a moment, the silence of a museum hall today. There, resting on a concrete plinth, sits a T-34 divided by 76. Its green paint is chipped, its tracks are rusted, and the smell of diesel has long since faded. It looks small compared to modern monsters. But walk around to the front. Look at that 60-degree slope. Look at the wide tracks. Run your hand over the rough weld lines that were fused together by a teenager in a freezing factory in the Urals while the world burned. You are touching the machine that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. You are touching the physical manifestation of a desperate nation's will to survive. The story of the German inspection of the T-34 is more than a footnote in military history. It is a parable of innovation born from necessity versus innovation born from pride. The Germans sought the perfect sword, forged with science and precision. The Soviets built a sledgehammer, and when the two met in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front, the sledgehammer didn't just break the sword, it shattered the hand that held it. The T-34 forced the German engineers to look into the mirror and realize that their supposed superiority was an illusion. In the end, the gun that was useless was not the Soviet 76, but the German belief that they were untouchable. That realization, arriving too late to save them, was the coldest reality of all. To fully appreciate the scope of this technological shock, we must delve even deeper into the specific operational nightmares that plagued the German forces following the initial encounters. The panic was not merely confined to the anti-tank crews. It permeated the armored divisions themselves. The Panzer III, the designated tank killer of the German army armed with a 50mm gun, found itself impotent. Tank commanders reported engaging T-34 seconds at ranges as close as 50 meters, watching their armor-piercing rounds strike the turret ring or the driver's hatch, traditionally weak points, only to see the shells shatter or ricochet. In one documented engagement near Orel, a single T-34 received 33 direct hits from German 37mm and 50mm guns. It not only survived, but continued to fight, destroying 2 Panzer IIIs and an anti-tank battery before finally running out of ammunition and withdrawing. The German crews were left staring at the battered, scarred, but unbroken Soviet tank retreating into the distance, a ghost that refused to die. This resilience was partly due to the high-hardness steel used by the Soviets. While Western armor tended to be softer and more ductile to prevent spalling deadly metal fragments breaking off inside the tank upon impact, the Soviet armor was extremely hard. This made it more prone to cracking under sustained fire, but it also made it incredibly resistant to penetration by lower-caliber rounds. The German shells, designed to punch through softer steel, often shattered against the face-hardened Soviet plates. It was a metallurgical game of rock-paper-scissors that the Germans were losing. The crisis reached the very top of the Nazi hierarchy. Hitler himself, who often fancied himself a military and technical genius, was enraged. He had been assured by his intelligence services that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse and that their equipment was junk. Now, his generals were telling him that they needed a completely new generation of tanks to compete. This triggered the frantic development of the heavy tank destroyers as a stopgap measure. Vehicles like the Marder series essentially captured French or Czech chassis mounted with captured Soviet 76mm guns began to appear. It is a supreme irony of the war that for a significant period in 1942, one of the most effective German anti-tank weapons was the very gun they had faced on the T-34, captured in large numbers and turned against its former masters. The Germans respected the gun so much they rechristened it the Park 36R and rushed it into service, admitting tacitly that their own industrial output had failed to provide a solution. We must also consider the logistical genius of the T-34's design regarding the strategic materials crisis. Germany was perpetually short of rubber, a critical component for road wheels and track pads. The T-34's steel road wheels, on later models, were designed to operate without rubber tires if necessary. The noise was deafening, the vibration terrible for the crew, but the tank could move. The Germans, with their complex rubber-intensive designs, found their production lines stalled when Allied bombing raids targeted rubber refineries. The Soviet design philosophy assumed shortages. The German philosophy assumed ideal supply chains. War, as it turns out, is rarely ideal. The rude awakening also spurred a revolution in anti-tank tactics. The German infantry began to be issued with the shaped, charge weapons that would eventually evolve into the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. These weapons used a chemical principle, the Monroe effect, to burn a hole through armor rather than punching through it with kinetic energy. This was a direct response to the thick, sloped armor of the T-34 and KV-1 tanks. The T-34, therefore, is directly responsible for the proliferation of handheld anti-tank rockets, a legacy that continues to the RPG 7 seconds and javelins of modern warfare. It forced the infantryman to become a tank destroyer. But let us return to the human element, to the Soviet factories where the T-34 was born. The evacuation of Soviet industry is one of the greatest feats of organization in human history. As the Wehrmacht advanced, thousands of factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved east of the Ural Mountains. In unheated sheds, often without roofs, women, children, and the elderly worked 18-hour shifts to build the T-34. Their hands froze to the metal. They starved, but they built. The design of the T-34 allowed for this untrained workforce. It did not require the artisanal finish of a Panzer. It tolerated large tolerances. A weld could be ugly as long as it held. This connection between the design of the machine and the reality of its manufacture is often overlooked. The T-34 was designed for the people who would build it, just as much as for the soldiers who would fight in it. Contrast this with the German Tiger. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, handcrafted by skilled artisans. But when those artisans were drafted to the front or killed in bombing raids, the production quality suffered. The Tiger required a level of industrial sophistication that was disintegrating under the pressure of total war. The T-34 thrived in chaos. The German tanks required order. The T-34 shock also influenced the Western Allies. When the Americans and British finally encountered the Panther in Normandy in 1944, they were shocked to find a tank that outclassed their Shermans. They were effectively experiencing the second wave of the T-34's impact. The Panther was the German answer to the T-34, and now the Allies had to answer the Panther. This led to the rush for the Firefly Shermans and the M26 Pershing. The ripple effect of Koshkin's design reached all the way to the hedgerows of France. As the war ground to its bloody conclusion, the T-34 evolved. The T-34, divided by 85, appeared in 1944, featuring a larger three-man turret and a powerful 85mm gun. This upgrade kept the tank relevant against the new German Cats. It was a testament to the versatility of the original chassis that it could accept such a significant upgrade without a complete redesign. The Germans, by contrast, were constantly designing entirely new vehicles, the Tiger II, the Jagdtiger splintering their production lines and creating a logistical nightmare of incompatible parts. The Soviets stuck to the platform that worked. In the final analysis, the inspection of the captured T-34 inches 1941 was the moment the Second World War was decided technologically. It was the moment the Germans lost the initiative. Until that point, they dictated the terms of engagement. After that point, they were reacting. They were chasing the standards set by the Soviets. They built bigger, heavier, more complex machines in a desperate attempt to regain the advantage, but they never could match the strategic elegance of the T-34. The T-34 was not a perfect tank. It was blind, uncomfortable, and unsafe for its crew. But it was the perfect tank for the war it fought. It was a weapon of total war, a consumption asset to be used and replaced. The German engineers who sneered at its rough edges in 1941 failed to understand that in a war of survival, perfection is the enemy of victory. They realized their guns were useless, but the greater tragedy for them was that their entire philosophy of war-making was obsolete. The T-34 did not just bounce their shells, it bounced their ideology. It proved that a rough, ugly, mass-produced machine, driven by a peasant defending his homeland, was superior to the finest engineering the master race could produce. And that, ultimately, was the rudest awakening of all. Delving deeper into the specific tactical adjustments made by the Wehrmacht in the agonizing months following the initial shock, the infantry, stripped of their faith in their anti-tank battalions, began to improvise with a desperation that bordered on madness. We must look closely at the tank destruction badges, strips of silver and blackened fabric awarded to individual soldiers who destroyed a tank with handheld weapons. This decoration became a grim status symbol on the Eastern Front. It represented a shift in warfare where the individual soldier was expected to close within meters of a 26-ton steel monster to place a magnetic mine or throw a bundle of grenades. The T-34, by rendering the long-range anti-tank guns obsolete, forced the war into a terrifying intimacy. Consider the memoirs of soldiers like Guy Sarge, or the accounts from the Grossdeutschland division. They describe the unique sound of the T-34's tracks, a clattering, metallic squeal distinct from the deeper thrum of German armor. This sound became the soundtrack of their nightmares. They speak of the T-34 dance, a tactical maneuver where the Soviet tanks would drive directly over German foxholes, crushing the occupants or collapsing the earth upon them, then spin their tracks to grind the position into oblivion. This was psychological warfare manifested in steel. The German response was to dig deeper, to create foxhole star systems, and to rely on the brave, often suicidal actions of the Panzerknacker, the tank busters. We must also expand on the role of the Soviet tank commanders who utilized the T-34's capabilities to their fullest. Men like Dmitry Lavrinenko, a tank ace who scored 52 kills in just 2.5 months in 1941. Lavrinenko fought in the chaotic battles for Moscow. He understood that the T-34's advantage lay in its mobility. He utilized ambush and dash tactics. He would position his tank in a copse of trees or behind a burning building, wait for the German column to expose its flanks, fire 3 or 4 rapid shots with the 76mm gun, and then use the V2 engine's torque to accelerate away before the German turrets could traverse. He treated the T-34 not as a fortress, but as a saber. His death in December 1941, killed by a stray mortar shell outside his tank, cut short a career that exemplified the new Soviet doctrine: aggressive, mobile, and relentless. The engineering repercussions in Germany extended beyond the tank factories and into the chemistry labs. The propellant used in German ammunition had to be reformulated. To penetrate the T-34's armor, they needed higher velocities. Higher velocities meant higher chamber pressures. This required better steel for the gun barrels and more volatile propellants. This, in turn, increased the wear on the barrels, reducing their accuracy over time. It was a cascading series of technical challenges. Every solution the Germans engineered created 2 new problems. They developed tungsten-cored ammunition Panzergranate 40, which was highly effective against the T-34. But tungsten was a rare metal, critical for machine tools. Every tungsten shell fired at a T-34 was a drill bit or a cutting tool that could not be used in a factory to build an airplane engine. The T-34 was destroying the German economy simply by existing. Let us also examine the diesel controversy more closely. The German reluctance to switch to diesel engines for their tanks was not merely a matter of supply, but of stubborn doctrinal inertia. The Kriegsmarine used diesel for U-boats. The technology was understood. But the Heer, the army, argued that managing 2 types of fuel gasoline for tanks and trucks, diesel for nothing else, would collapse the logistics chain. So, they stuck with gasoline. This decision had horrific consequences. When a T-34 was hit, the diesel fuel often smoked or burned slowly, giving the crew precious seconds to escape. When a Panzer IV was hit, the high-octane gasoline vapors often detonated instantly, incinerating the crew before they could unlatch the hatches. The Ronson nickname, often applied to the American Sherman Light's first time, every time was equally applicable to the gasoline-fueled Panzers. The German engineers who inspected the T-34 inches 1941 noted the safety factor of the diesel fuel, but their recommendation was overruled by logisticians who were fighting a spreadsheet war rather than a battlefield one. The story of the T-34 is also the story of the Christie suspension's vindication. J. Walter Christie was an eccentric genius, a man who designed race cars and believed that tanks should move like them. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department found him difficult to work with and his designs unreliable. They wanted stability. Christie offered speed. When the Soviets bought his prototypes in the early 1930s, they were buying a philosophy of movement. They improved it, toughened it, and simplified it. The German engineers, staring at the suspension in 1941, were looking at an American invention, perfected by Russians, destroying German ambitions. It was a global irony. The Wehrmacht was being dismantled by a cosmopolitan machine, American suspension, German, influenced optics from pre-war cooperation, and a British-inspired diesel engine design derived from aircraft engine concepts, all synthesized into a uniquely Russian whole. We should also touch upon the cultural impact within the German High Command. The Tank Commission of November 1941 was one of the few times the Nazi regime allowed objective truth to penetrate its bubble of propaganda. For a brief window, the engineers were permitted to say, "We are inferior." This moment of honesty was fleeting. Soon, the propaganda machine spun the narrative that the T-34 was a crude copy of German concepts, or that its numbers were the only factor. But the transcripts of those meetings reveal a genuine intellectual terror. Ferdinand, Porsche, and Dr. Aders of Henschel were not debating minor tweaks. They were discussing a fundamental restructuring of German armored fighting vehicle design. The famous Tiger tank, heavily associated with Porsche and Henschel, owes its wide tracks and powerful gun directly to the fear instilled by the T-34. Without the T-34, the Tiger might have remained a paper project or a much lighter vehicle. Another aspect often overlooked is the ergonomic hell of the T-34 and how it paradoxically aided the Soviet war effort. The interior was unfinished. Sharp edges abounded. There was no turret basket, meaning the floor did not rotate with the turret. The loader had to constantly step over the spinning driveshaft cover and avoid being crushed by the breech of the gun. It was exhausting. Brutal work. But by eliminating creature comforts, the designers saved weight and volume. A German tank had padded seats, protected wiring, and painted surfaces. This added hundreds of man-hours to production. The Soviet philosophy was, the tank will likely be destroyed in 3 battles. Why paint the inside? This grim calculus allowed them to produce 55,000 T-34 seconds during the war. The German focus on crew comfort and vehicle longevity was a noble engineering sentiment, but a fatal strategic error in a war of annihilation. The narrative must also travel to the United States, to the Aberdeen Proving Ground. In 1942, the Soviets sent a T-34 to their American allies for evaluation. The American report is a fascinating counterpoint to the German one. The Americans were critical. They hated the transmission, calling it archaic. They mocked the air cleaner, saying it would destroy the engine in a dusty environment, which it often did. They found the welding appalling, but they, like the Germans, were stunned by the armor slope and the diesel engine. However, the Americans, safe across the ocean and with massive industrial capacity, concluded that the T-34 was not suitable for American adoption. They preferred their Shermans, which were reliable, comfortable, and had excellent radios. The Americans missed the point that the Germans had learned the hard way. Reliability is a luxury. Survivability and firepower are necessities. The T-34 was not built for the parade ground at Aberdeen. It was built for the hell of the Eastern Front. As the war progressed into 1944, the T-34's influence morphed again. the Germans began to field the Panzerfaust in massive numbers. The Soviets responded by welding bed springs and mesh screens to their turrets to pre-detonate the shaped charges, an early form of slat armor seen today on vehicles in the Middle East. The T-34 was a canvas for improvisation. Crews welded extra track links to the glacis plate for added protection, poured concrete over the front, or covered the tank in logs. The machine was adaptable. A German Panther was a finely tuned instrument. Modifying it often broke it. A T-34 was a tractor. You could do anything to it, and it would likely still run. Let us zoom in on the Battle of Prokhorovka in July 1943. This was the death ride of the German panzers. The elite SS Panzer Corps, equipped with Tigers and Panthers, faced the 5th Guards tank army. The T-34 seconds, realizing their guns could not penetrate the frontal armor of the Tigers at long range, charged. They drove at full speed into the German formation, closing the range to point blank. It was a brawl. T-34 seconds rammed Tigers. They fired into the thinner side armor from 10 meters away. The German superiority in optics and gunnery was negated by the dust, the smoke, and the sheer audacity of the Soviet charge. The T-34 seconds took catastrophic losses, but they stopped the German advance. They traded metal for time and bodies for territory. It was the ultimate validation of Koshkin's design philosophy. A tank that could be sacrificed to win the battle. The rude awakening also destroyed the career of many German officers. Those who pointed out the superiority of the T-34 too loudly were often dismissed as defeatists. General Guderian himself fell out of favor, partly because of his relentless insistence that the Panzer Arm needed to be completely reformed to face the Soviet threat. The T-34 was not just a weapon, it was a political wedge that drove apart the German command structure. It created a rift between the frontline commanders, who dealt with the reality of the monster, and the staff officers in Berlin, who dealt with the fantasy of the Untermensch. In the post-war era, the T-34's legacy continued. It became the symbol of the revolution, exported to every communist nation and proxy state. It fought in Korea, where it once again shocked an arrogant Western power, this time the United States forces in the opening days of 1950. American bazookas bounced off the T-34, divided by 85 seconds of the North Korean People's Army, just as German shells had done a decade earlier. The Task Force Smith disaster was a replay of the German experience, equipped infantry facing a tank they could not kill. The T-34 forced the US to rush the M20 Super Bazooka and the M46 Patton tank into service. The ghost of Koshkin was still haunting the battlefield, teaching a new generation the same bloody lesson. We must conclude with the image of the T-34 not just as a machine, but as a monolith of history. The rude awakening of 1941 was the turning point of the technological war. It was the moment the Victorian era of warfare, where gallantry and pedigree mattered, was finally crushed by the industrial age. The T-34 was the herald of the modern age, cold, efficient, mass-produced, and utterly lethal. When the German engineers stood on that frozen steppe, measuring the slope of the armor, they were measuring the angle of their own decline. They were looking at the future, and it did not speak German. The uselessness of their guns was a symptom of the uselessness of their worldview. They had brought a knife to a gunfight, a beautifully crafted, jeweled knife, but a knife nonetheless. The T-34 was the gun. And it was loaded. The echoes of those bouncing shells in 1941 still resonate. They tell us that innovation often comes from the margins, from the underestimated and the desperate. They tell us that simplicity beats complexity when the stakes are survival. And they remind us that in the unforgiving arithmetic of war, the only variable that truly matters is the one that works. The T-34 worked. And because it worked, the 1,000-year Reich ended in 12 years, crushed under the wide tracks of the machine they never saw coming.